The humid air in the old house was thick with the scent of wilted lilies and dust, a cloying perfume that clung to the back of my throat. I could feel the weight of the late afternoon sun pressing through the bay window, heating the worn velvet of the armchair I'd been relegated to, while my brother, Carlos, sat squarely in our father's old leather throne, the one positioned closest to mother. The sound of the ceiling fan was a slow, tired clatter above us, doing little more than stirring the grief and the tension into a suffocating soup. We were waiting for Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer. We were waiting to hear how our mother, Maria, had divided a lifetime. My entire life, I, Sophia, have felt like a guest in this family, a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the decor. I could smell the faint, familiar aroma of Carlos's cologne, something sharp and expensive, cutting through the floral decay. It was the same scent that had filled the house when he'd gotten his first car, his college acceptance, his promotion. Every milestone of his was a public holiday in our home, celebrated with fanfare and feasts. Mine were quiet footnotes, remembered with a pat on the head and a, "That's nice, dear." I remember the chill of a long-ago December, the year I was 10 and Carlos was 13. The living room was a riot of color and light, the synthetic pine smell of the Christmas tree mixing with the savory promise of a roast in the oven. Carlos, with the effortless charm that was his birthright, had been begging for a new gaming console. His words were not a plea, but a performance, and my mother watched him with stars in her eyes. "Of course, meu filho," she'd said, her voice a warm caress. "Anything for my brilliant boy. You deserve it for your good grades." Later that evening, shivering in my thin nightgown, I had tentatively shown her my own report card, a constellation of perfect A's. I'd worked for them, my fingers often numb from holding a pencil too tight, my stomach in knots before every test. She'd glanced at it, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Very good, Sophia. It's good to see you applying yourself." Her hand had felt cool and brief on my shoulder before she turned back to admiring the large, perfectly wrapped box with Carlos's name on it. The console cost $400. I got a $20 bill tucked inside a greeting card. The disparity wasn't just in the value, it was in the temperature of the love that came with it. I could feel the paper of that bill, cold and impersonal in my hand, while I watched Carlos's joy, a radiant, warm thing that heated the entire room. That pattern became the rhythm of our lives, a drumbeat of favoritism I learned to walk to. When Carlos went to an out-of-state university, his tuition paid in full, the house echoed with his absence. My mother would sigh, touching his framed photograph with a tenderness I rarely felt. "My Carlos, he's going to do such great things." I attended the local community college, taking the bus every day. The money I saved from a part-time job went for my books and fees, while my mother helped Carlos with the down payment on his first condo. I could still hear the crunch of gravel under my tires in our old driveway, a sound I associated with coming home to a place that never truly felt like mine, while Carlos's new condo, which I visited once, smelled of new paint and privilege. The most profound wound, the one that never truly healed, was over my daughter, Lily. 5 years ago, when my husband, David, and I were struggling, drowning in medical bills after a complicated pregnancy, I had swallowed my pride and asked my mother for a loan. Just a small one, enough to keep us afloat for a few months. The kitchen had been filled with the smell of her brewing coffee, a rich, dark scent that should have been comforting. She'd listened, her face a mask of polite concern, and then she'd said the words that still felt like shards of glass in my heart. "Sophia, you made your choices. You have to learn to live with them. Carlos, he has a family to provide for, a future to secure." Carlos had a family, yes. A wife who didn't work, 2 children in private schools. We had Lily, our miracle, and a mountain of debt. She gave him $50,000 that year, for what he called an investment opportunity. She gave me nothing but a lesson in my own perceived insignificance. David held me that night, his own body tense with a helpless anger, as I cried silent tears into his shirt, the salt of them a sharp taste on my lips. The warmth of his embrace was the only thing that kept the cold of my mother's rejection from turning me to ice. And now, here we were. The lilies were for her. She was gone. The finality of it was a physical pressure in the room, a silence so deep you could hear the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Mr. Abernathy, a man who smelled of peppermint and old paper, finally cleared his throat. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Your mother, Maria, was a very precise woman," he began, his voice a dry rustle. He put on a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, the lenses catching the light. "She was very clear about her final wishes." Carlos leaned forward, the leather of our father's chair groaning in deference. I could see the confident gleam in his eyes, the almost imperceptible relaxation of his shoulders. He was already mentally spending his inheritance. His wife, Elena, sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her fingers adorned with rings that glittered coldly. I sat with David, our hands clasped tightly together on my lap. My palm was slick with a cold sweat against his warm, steady skin. I wasn't expecting much. Perhaps a small sum, a piece of jewelry. I had long ago made peace with the fact that in my mother's eyes, I was an afterthought. To my daughter-in-law, Elena, Mr. Abernathy read, his tone flat and professional, I leave my pearl necklace and the sum of $25,000, to be used for the grandchildren's education. Elena's breath hitched, a small, pleased sound. She squeezed Carlos's arm. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. To my son, Carlos, my beloved son, he paused, and Carlos seemed to inflate, his chest swelling with anticipated victory. I leave the property at 122 Magnolia Drive, the contents thereof, and the sum of $250,000 from my savings and investments. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Carlos's face. He didn't look at me. He looked at the ceiling, as if thanking God, or perhaps our mother, for this final, definitive affirmation. The house. The money. It was everything. It was what he'd always gotten. I felt David's grip on my hand tighten, a silent communication of shared resignation. This was the expected outcome. The story of our lives. I focused on the feeling of his thumb stroking my knuckles, a small anchor in a sea of familiar hurt. Mr. Abernathy was not finished. He took a slow sip of water from a crystal glass on the side table, the clink of the glass unnaturally loud. And to my daughter, Sophia. I looked up, my heart a dull, aching thud in my chest. I prepared myself for it. The leftover piece of jewelry. The token $5,000. That's nice, dear, of bequests. I bequeath the remainder of my estate. The words hung in the air, strange and nonsensical. I blinked. The remainder? What remainder? The house and the bulk of the money had just been given to Carlos. Carlos's smile didn't fade, it just became confused. The remainder, he chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. What does that mean, some old china? Mr. Abernathy's eyes met mine over the rims of his glasses. His expression was unreadable. It means, Sophia, that you inherit the contents of a safety deposit box held at First National Bank, which, according to your mother's instructions, contains the true and majority portion of her wealth. The room went perfectly, utterly silent. The tired clatter of the fan, the distant hum of a lawnmower, it all ceased to exist. I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. Carlos's face went through a terrifying transformation. The confident smile melted away, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion that quickly hardened into a hot, disbelieving anger. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice rising, cutting through the stillness. The true portion? What is this? The house, the money, that's the estate. The safety deposit box, Mr. Abernathy repeated calmly, though I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of drama he was not immune to, holds assets that far exceed the value of the property and the liquid funds just described. Your mother's instructions were explicit. The key was to be given to Sophia alone. He reached into his briefcase, the click of the latches sounding like two tiny gunshots. He pulled out a small, unassuming brass key and placed it on the coffee table between us. It lay there, a simple, cold piece of metal, yet it felt like the most powerful, dangerous object I had ever seen. Carlos shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. This is ridiculous. A mistake. She would never. She loved me. She told me everything. His face was flushed a deep, mottled red. I could smell the sharp tang of his sweat, the cologne now seeming sour. You, he spat, turning his fury on me. What did you do? What lies did you tell her when she was weak? I was too stunned to speak. My mouth was dry as dust. I just stared at the key, my mind reeling. The true and majority portion. The words made no sense. They were a language I didn't speak, a country I had never visited. David stood up, his tall frame a sudden, protective wall between me and Carlos's rage. That's enough, Carlos, he said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge I rarely heard. Sit down. The two brothers-in-law stared at each other, the air between them crackling with decades of unspoken resentment. Elena was pulling at Carlos's sleeve, her voice a frantic whisper. Mr. Abernathy remained impassive, a monument to legal procedure in the storm of family chaos. I didn't hear the rest of the argument. My entire being was focused on that key. It was as if my mother had reached from beyond the grave and handed me a riddle. For the first time in my life, I was not the afterthought. I was the center of the mystery. And I had no idea why. Continua a história. The drive to the bank the next morning was a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. A fine, cold rain had begun to fall, streaking the car windows and turning the world outside into a smeared watercolor. David was driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He hadn't said much since we'd left the house, the memory of Carlos's furious, spittle-flecked accusations still hanging in the air between us like a bad smell. I held the brass key in my clenched fist, its teeth biting into my palm, a small, sharp pain that kept me grounded in a reality that felt increasingly surreal. "He'll calm down," David said finally, breaking the long silence. His voice was careful, neutral. "He's just in shock." "Is he?" I whispered, my own voice hoarse from a sleepless night. I stared at the rain on the windshield, each drop a tiny, fractured lens. Or is he just being Carlos? The world has always given him what he wanted. This is the first time it hasn't. I thought of the look on his face, not just of anger, but of betrayal. A deep, fundamental betrayal that mirrored my own feelings for most of my life. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. We parked in the nearly empty lot of the First National Bank, a grand, old building of carved stone that seemed to frown down upon us. The air inside was cool and smelled of polished brass and floor wax, a sterile scent that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The bank manager, a Mr. Sterling, led us to the vault after verifying our identity and the paperwork Mr. Abernathy had provided. His shoes made a precise, clicking sound on the marble floor that echoed in the vast, silent space. The vault door was a massive, round wheel of polished steel, and when it swung open, it released a sigh of cold, metallic air. He guided us to a small, private room and placed the long, gray metal box on a table. "Take all the time you need," he said, his voice respectfully quiet before he withdrew, closing the door and leaving us alone with my mother's secret. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. David stood beside me, a solid, warm presence. "Ready?" he asked softly. I nodded, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely fit the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, heavy click that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. I lifted the lid. There was no stack of bonds, no pile of gold coins. Instead, the box contained two things. On top lay a sealed, thick ivory-colored envelope with my name written on it in my mother's elegant, looping cursive. The sight of her handwriting sent a physical jolt through me, a confusing mix of love and pain. Beneath it was a smaller, older, hinged box made of dark, polished wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl in a delicate floral pattern. It was beautiful, and I had never seen it before in my life. My hands were shaking as I picked up the envelope. I broke the seal, the sound like a dry leaf crumbling. I pulled out several sheets of paper, filled with my mother's writing. I began to read, my eyes scanning the words, and with each sentence, the floor of my understanding fell away, plunging me into a past I never knew existed. "My dearest Sophia," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have learned of the unusual nature of my will. First, and most importantly, I need you to know that I have loved you, my daughter, with a fierceness and a depth that I fear I was never able to show you in life. My failure to do so is my greatest regret, a shadow that has darkened all my days." A hot tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek. I could smell the faint, ghostly scent of her perfume on the paper, Shalimar, a scent I associated with her distance, her coolness. Now, it felt like an embrace from beyond the grave. "The story you know," the letter continued, "is not the whole story. Carlos is not your father's son." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I gasped, my legs buckling. David's arm was around me instantly, holding me up. "Sophia? What is it?" I couldn't speak. I could only read, my eyes devouring the words, each one rewriting the history of my family, of my very identity. "Before I met your father, Antonio, I was very young and very foolish. I fell in love with a man named Raphael. He was passionate, artistic, and unavailable. Our affair was brief, intense, and secret. When I discovered I was pregnant with Carlos, Raphael had vanished. He wanted no part of it. I was alone, ashamed, and terrified. Then I met Antonio. He was a good man, a kind man. He knew I was pregnant, and he married me anyway. He gave Carlos his name, and he loved him as his own, though he never knew the truth of his parentage. He believed Raphael was a fleeting romance that ended before we met. I saw my father's face in my mind, his gentle eyes, his patient smile. The man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had mended my dolls. The knowledge that he had carried this secret, this immense act of grace, without ever knowing the full truth, was a staggering, heartbreaking revelation. My guilt, my mother's letter went on, was my prison. Every time I looked at Carlos, I saw my mistake. I saw the man who had abandoned me. And so, I overcompensated. I poured all my love, all my attention, all my resources into him, trying to absolve myself of my sin, trying to make up for the father he never had. I thought I was protecting him. In doing so, my precious Sophia, I failed you. I failed you utterly. You were the child of my true love, of the good and faithful man I built a life with. You were the daughter I was always so proud of, so in awe for your quiet strength and integrity. And I punished you for it. I pushed you away because your goodness was a constant, silent reproach to the lie I was living. Every time I saw Antonio's love for you, so pure and uncomplicated, my guilt would choke me. It was easier to focus on Carlos, to make his life a monument to my atonement. I let out a sob, the sound raw and painful in the quiet room. Decades of confusion, of feeling unseen, of heartache, suddenly crystallized into a perfect, devastating sense of clarity. It wasn't that she didn't love me. She loved me too much, and the sight of me was a constant reminder of the betrayal she had inflicted upon the man we both loved, my father. Her favoritism wasn't preference, it was a penance. The contents of the wooden box, the letter concluded, belong to you. They are your true inheritance, from your true family line. I have saved and invested for you alone all these years. The money in the accounts, which Mr. Abernathy will detail, is substantial. It is yours, free and clear. It is my apology, though I know no amount of money can ever mend a broken heart. Please, Sophia, try to forgive me. Try to remember that a mother's heart is a complicated and often flawed thing. I loved you. I always have. With all my soul, your mother. I lowered the letter, my body trembling uncontrollably. David took the pages from my numb fingers, his own eyes wide with shock as he read them. I turned to the wooden box. With hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a collection of breathtaking jewelry. A necklace of large, flawless emeralds surrounded by diamonds. Matching earrings. A pair of bracelets. They were old, exquisite, pieces of a magnitude I had never seen outside a museum. They glittered coldly in the sterile banklight. And tucked beside them was a faded photograph of a beautiful, severe-looking woman I did not recognize, wearing the very same emeralds. On the back, in a spidery script, was written, "For my granddaughter, Sophia. May you wear these in health and happiness. Your grandmother, Isabella." My grandmother. Not the kind, simple woman I had known on my father's side. This was a different grandmother. My mother's mother. The one who had, according to family lore, died penniless. It was another lie. This was the true inheritance. Not just the money, but a legacy. My legacy. I felt dizzy, unmoored. The entire architecture of my life had been a facade, and with a few strokes of a pen, my mother had demolished it, revealing a strange, new, and terrifying foundation. My God, David breathed, having finished the letter. He looked from the jewels to my face. Sophia, this changes everything. Does it? I whispered, my voice cracking. The emeralds seemed to watch me, their green depths holding secrets upon secrets. The cold weight of the truth was far heavier than any jewel. My brother was not my brother. My mother was not the woman I thought she was. And I was the heir to a fortune built on a lie that had poisoned our family for a lifetime. Continua a história. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. We found Carlos waiting for us on our front porch, his figure a dark, angry silhouette against the soft glow of the evening light. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and asphalt, a clean scent that did nothing to purify the toxicity between us. He had clearly been drinking. I could smell the whiskey on his breath from 10 feet away, a sweet, dangerous aroma. David stepped in front of me again, but I placed a hand on his arm. "No," I said quietly. "This is between us." Carlos's eyes were bloodshot, his face a mask of wounded pride and raw fury. "Well," he snarled, not even bothering with a greeting. "What was in the box? My share, I hope? Did you bring me my check?" I took a deep breath, the letter and the key to the safety deposit box now heavy in my purse, feeling like they weighed 1,000 pounds. "There is no share for you, Carlos," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. His laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. "Of course not. Why break the habit of a lifetime? You always were greedy, Sophia. Always skulking in the corners, jealous of what I had." The old hurt flared, but it was quickly doused by the cool, clarifying water of the truth. "It wasn't about jealousy," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "It was never about you and me. It was about her. And her guilt." He took a menacing step forward. "What the hell are you talking about? The inheritance, the majority of it, is mine because I am Antonio's daughter." I let the words hang in the air. His biological daughter. Carlos froze. His brow furrowed in confusion. What kind of nonsense is this? We're both his children." "No, Carlos," I said, and I actually felt a pang of pity for him, for the bomb I was about to drop on his world. "You are not. Your father was a man named Raphael. He left Mom before you were born. Dad, Antonio, married her knowing she was pregnant. He gave you his name. He loved you as his own." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. All the anger seemed to drain from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy shock. He looked like a little boy, lost and terrified. "That's a lie," he whispered, but the conviction was gone from his voice. It was a plea. "You're lying to keep the money." "I have a letter from her," I said softly. "She explains everything." She spent your whole life trying to make it up to you, to compensate for the father you never had. That's why she gave you everything. That's why she favored you. It wasn't because she loved you more. It was because of her shame. He stumbled back as if I'd struck him, colliding with one of the porch pillars. The fight was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrifying comprehension. I could see the memories flashing behind his eyes, the same memories I had, but now being recontextualized, reinterpreted through this brutal new lens. Every gift, every privilege, every word of praise was now tainted, revealed not as tokens of supreme favoritism, but as payments on a debt of maternal guilt. No, he moaned, sinking down onto the top step of the porch and burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. No, no, no. The sound was one of pure anguish, the sound of a man watching his entire history turn to ash in his mouth. The man he had idolized, the father whose approval he had spent a lifetime seeking, was not his father at all. The mother he had adored had built their relationship on a foundation of lies. The identity he had clung to was a fiction. I stood there, watching him come apart, and I felt no victory. Only a profound, bone-deep sadness. We were both victims of the same secret, just in different ways. He had been smothered by a love that was really penance, and I had been starved by a guilt that masqueraded as indifference. After a long time, he looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and empty. Did he know? He asked, his voice ragged. Did Dad know? Mom's letter says he did not. He believed Raphael was before their time. He thought he was your real father. Carlos let out another choked sob, this one of relief and even greater grief. The one constant in his life, the goodness of Antonio, remained untarnished. The betrayal was solely our mother's. He pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. He wouldn't look at me. He just turned and walked away, down the path to his expensive car, his posture slumped, the image of a king who had just discovered his crown was plastic. He didn't say another word. He just got in and drove away, the sleek vehicle moving silently into the twilight. I stood on the porch for a long time, leaning against David, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against my back. The air was cool on my skin. I could hear the distant chirping of crickets, a sound that usually signaled peace, but now just felt like the background noise to a world that had been permanently altered. The money was mine. A life-changing amount, according to Mr. Abernathy's subsequent call. The emeralds were in a secure location, their cold fire a symbol of a lineage I was only just beginning to comprehend. But the wealth felt abstract, distant. The real inheritance was the truth. It was a key that had unlocked the prison of my past, but it had also thrown open the doors to a future filled with complicated and painful questions. I thought of my mother, not with the burning resentment of before, but with a weary, complicated sorrow. I could finally see the lonely, terrified young woman she had been, trapped by a single mistake, building a life of atonement that ended up hurting everyone she loved. Her love for me had been real, but it had been locked away in a vault of her own making, just like those emeralds. She had only found the courage to set it free in death. And Carlos. My brother, who was not my brother. The boy I had grown up with, the man I had envied. The bond we shared, forged in a shared childhood home, was now twisted into something new and fragile. The love was still there, buried under mountains of lies and resentment, but it was wounded. It would need time to heal, if it ever could. The following weeks were a strange, quiet limbo. Carlos did not contact us. The silence from his side of the family was deafening. We heard through the brittle grapevine of mutual acquaintances that Elena was furious, talking of contesting the will, but without any legal grounds. It was just empty noise. The truth, I suspected, had robbed Carlos of the will to fight. What would he be fighting for? To prove he was the rightful son of a man who wasn't his father? David and I sat with financial planners, their offices smelling of new carpet and ambition. We looked at columns of numbers that represented security for Lily, a college fund that would never run dry, a house without a leaking roof, the freedom for David to leave a job he tolerated but did not love. It was a breathtaking gift, yet it was perpetually shadowed by the cost at which it had come. One afternoon, I found myself alone in our living room. The sun was streaming in, warm on the worn rug. I held the photograph of my grandmother, Isabella. Her eyes, dark and serious, stared back at me. Who was she? What was her story? My mother had kept her, and my true history, a secret my entire life. That box had not just held jewels and money, it held an identity. I was not just the overlooked daughter. I was the granddaughter of a woman of obvious substance. I was the true heir of Antonio, the good man. I had a legacy, both material and moral, to understand and to uphold. I realized then that the story was not over. The reading of the will was not the climax, it was the end of the first act. My mother's revelation had closed one door with a definitive, shocking slam, but it had opened a dozen others, leading down hallways I had never known existed. There were questions to be answered about this grandmother, about my mother's early life, about the man named Raphael. There was a relationship with Carlos to be navigated, a chasm of pain and misunderstanding to be crossed, or at least acknowledged. And there was the final, most difficult task of all, forgiveness. Forgiving my mother for her long, painful charade. Forgiving myself for a lifetime of believing I was less than. Perhaps, one day, even finding a way to forgive Carlos for simply being the beneficiary of a love he never knew was a lie. The money could buy many things, but it could not buy back the years, nor could it instantly heal the scars etched so deeply on our hearts. That would be the work of a lifetime. I looked out the window at the quiet street, the same view I had seen for years, but now it looked different. The world was the same, but I was not. I was Sophia, the heir. Not just to a fortune, but to a truth. And I was only just beginning to understand what that meant. História finalizada.